Greetings, friends, and welcome to In the Scriptures, a program where we explore a variety of topics from the Bible and their significance to the time that they are written in, and most importantly, their significance to us today. I hope our time together is a blessing to you. Without a doubt, the Bible is one of the most contested books in history, not only regarding its validity, but also regarding the various doctrinal positions that are held by so many different people. It's impossible to cover all of those doctrinal differences in one program. In fact, it's almost impossible to cover them all in a lifetime. As soon as you believe that you have met every argument possible, somebody else will come along and add to that long list of contended points. As such, the goal is not to meet every argument that comes along, but rather to be well grounded in what is in the Scriptures. If we could take all the various points in which there are differing perspectives on the Bible and compile them all together, then one thing that we would begin to see is that one area in which there is the greatest diversity of views is in that of prophetic interpretation. In fact, there are almost as many different interpretations of Bible prophecy as there are churches. But does this need to be the case? The Bible gives us everything we need to understand the prophecies that are contained within it. And as long as we are taking the time to rightly divide the Scriptures, that is, to understand things in their proper context as it relates to time, place, and the people that are involved, then understanding Bible prophecy actually becomes much more simple than it is sometimes made out to be. In this edition of In the Scriptures, we're going to begin an exciting study of Bible prophecy. The study that we're going to look at this time lays the foundational groundwork and provides the master keys, if you will, to understanding almost all the rest of the prophecies contained in the Bible, especially that of the books of Daniel and Revelation. It therefore gives us great benefit to make sure that we are taking the time to understand and grasp not only the content of this study, but the grand purpose of it as well. The study that we're going to look at right now comes to us from the book of Daniel, specifically Daniel chapter 2. The reason this particular chapter is so important to the study of Bible prophecy is because it sheds tremendous light on the use of imagery and symbolism in Bible prophecy and provides tremendous insight into how to understand those images and symbols as well. After our study is over, I'll be back to give us some closing thoughts and to cap off our time together. So without further ado, let's get into our study of Daniel chapter 2. So the year was 1922, February of 1922 to be specific, and there was a wealthy Englishman, a lord, named Carnarvon. Have any of you ever heard of the program Downton Abbey? You've heard of it, right? Well, then I guess the main house, I've never seen it. I actually got this information here very recently. But the main house that's used in that television program was this man's house, okay? So this is a real character. He's not somebody that I'm just making up. But he was convinced that he could find the tomb of an ancient Egyptian king somewhere out in the sands of Egypt. So he funded a dig, hired an archaeologist. The archaeologist's name was Howard Carter, and they went out into the desert of Egypt, and they dug and poked and prodded and do all those kinds of things that people do on those kinds of expeditions. I've never done one, so I have no idea what's involved. But just about the time when all the money was drying up, no pun intended, and the time was running out, they found at least a doorway of something that had been unsealed. It had not been discovered. So they were the first ones to find it in who knows how many years. And they worked at it. They finally got the door open and they walked in. And what they found was a treasure trove of ancient Egyptian artifacts. There was priceless objects. There were alabaster vases, there were bouquets of flowers, there were beds and chairs, and there were 3 coffins, one of which was pure gold. You can see it behind me, pure gold. I cannot imagine how heavy that thing must have been. But what they ended up finding, they found the body of the boy king whose name was Tutankhamun. We would more commonly pronounce his name Tutankhamun. And this guy had been laying there undisturbed for over 3,000 years. And incidentally, to go back to that TV program, Downton Abbey, when they were kind of poking and prodding in this guy's house, somebody opened a cabinet door that, for whatever reason, had not been opened in like 70-some years at that point in time. And they found little artifacts that this guy, Carnarvon, smuggled out of Egypt from that tomb and stashed them in that little cubbyhole that he had. And they'd been sitting there for years. Interesting little tidbit there. But we're not interested tonight in digging in the sands of Egypt. Not too terribly much anyway. We're actually interested in finding something of greater value to discover. Remarkably, there are greater discoveries than any archaeologist can find that are contained within the scriptures. In fact, if you read Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, it says that the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. So right away, we are seeing that the book of Revelation is a revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, what this should tell us, first of all, is aside from what everything that's contained in the book of Revelation has, its main focus is on Christ. Aside from dates and times and places and people, the main focus is Christ. And what we're going to look at tonight, we're going to find the exact same thing. There are two different kinds of prophecy contained within the Bible. One is called covenant prophecy. In other words, if you do this, then this will happen. If you do this, this will happen. Okay? There's also then what's called apocalyptic prophecy, which is simply this is what will happen. It has no bearing on what your choices will be. It's simply a chain of events that will unfold. Okay? So an example would be God saying that if you obey me, then I will protect you. You will be blessed bountifully, as we find God conveying to the children of Israel back in the books of Moses. But then he says, but if you don't, then, you're kind of on your own. But then we have things in, say, the books of Daniel and Revelation, which are more, this is simply what is going to happen, and your choices have no bearing on it. It's what's going to happen. In fact, when we look into the book of Revelation, we also see that it says that what we read there in verse 1 of chapter 1 is that he is showing John things which must shortly take place. Things that are beginning at the time of John and moving forward from there. Likewise, when we're going to get into the book of Daniel, we're going to see the exact same thing. But let me ask you, when you open the Bible, do you ever find the language and the imagery and the content to just be very confusing and difficult to grapple with? If you think about it, the Bible starts out quite well. What are the first words of the Bible? In the beginning, God. Right? Starts out pretty good, but it doesn't take very long for that really good beginning to get very sour. And it's because of the introduction of sin onto this planet and into this human race, and it just spoils the whole story. And of course, we today are still living with the mess that was created all those many millennia ago. But yet, prophecy is meant to give us hope, and that's the primary thrust of what prophecy is. When we look at the book of Daniel, for example, Revelation has the mark of the beast, and Armageddon has the 7 last plagues. And believe it or not, many of you may know this, and some of you may not, the United States is contained upon the pages of prophecy, which should stand to make sense. I mean, here we are, the undisputed world superpower, have been for quite a few years now, and for how long, despite what the media tries to tell you, how long has it been that the world has been looking for leadership to the U.S.? What will you do to help us out? How will you help guide and direct world decisions? They have been doing this for quite a few years now. It should stand to reason that something that is that prominent of a superpower, especially what everybody thinks is the last days, should be in Bible prophecy. And we're going to see that in our study. Not so much tonight, but later on. Let alone the fact, when we examine the book of Revelation, 2/3 of the content of the book of Revelation are quotes or allusions back to the Old Testament. So this should also tell us something, that we cannot think to open the book of Revelation and to just read it and think we are going to adequately grasp what is there if we don't have at least a good fundamental understanding of the Old Testament. Because that's where all the imagery is being drawn from. is Old Testament language and allusions, and the people of the first century that the book of Revelation was written to, they would have grasped this because it's a very simple fact. In the first century, there was no New Testament. All the letters, yes, had been written. Paul had written Galatians and Corinthians. He wrote all those letters, but they were not compiled and put together in the New Testament as we know it for quite some time. So Christians in the time of John, what they were primarily reading was the Old Testament. That's all they really had as a compiled work for a very long time. And so when they're reading the book of Revelation, they would have gotten very keen insight into the imagery and the wording that's being used because it's using wording that's very familiar to them. Whereas for us today, we have so many more things to pick from and to draw from. One of the biggest mistakes that we try to do today is to read something like Revelation and inject our understanding into the pages and the words that are contained on it. And you will fail every time at trying to understand Revelation if that's what your approach is. But tonight, we are going to look at the master key for understanding Bible prophecy, especially apocalyptic prophecy. If we can grab this lesson, what we're going to look at tonight, you will have the master key to unlock all the rest of the apocalyptic prophecies contained within the Bible. Now, admittedly, what we're going to look at also is a very broad strokes kind of a study, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to paint with very broad strokes as we go through this chapter because that's what it is designed to do. As we continue, we're going to come back in and we're going to focus a little here, a little here, a little here. We're going to fill in that picture with all the rest of the information that's contained as we continue on. You're going to see a beautiful picture that emerges out of the scriptures of what it is that Christ is doing for each of us, where we stand on the prophetic timeline, what has happened, what is happening, and what is yet to happen. And it will blow you away how complete the picture of Bible prophecy is, of what the human condition is, who God is, and how the two relate to one another. Amen. So let's dig into Daniel chapter 2. We're going to read the first 4 verses here. Now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, to tell the king his dreams. Now these titles are all basically how we would reckon psychics today. That's essentially offices that they would have been holding as something like a psychic that we would have today. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was a very real individual from ancient history. As we have gone through school, we take American history, or well, at least I hope we would have taken American history. It's somewhere along the line in our education. And we study people like George Washington and John Adams and Abraham Lincoln and all these very prominent American historical figures. George Washington Carver, very, very significant individuals. I have had the privilege, because of places where I have been and people that I have known, I've known quite a few people who have actually lived and grown up in the Middle East. I've got a number of friends that have come from that part of the world. And just like when we study American history, and we're studying all these prominent figures to the American historical timeline, they look back and they study people like Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, this is very real stuff that they are studying, just like what we're looking at tonight. This, for them, is a very real figure from their history. And of course, the Middle Eastern history is far older than American history is. So at any rate, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. And it's something that impresses him quite a bit. So much so that it wakes him out of his sleep and he's not able to get back to sleep. Now here's the thing. Ancient kings typically would have thought of dreams as, this is the gods trying to communicate with me. That's how they would have seen this kind of a scenario. Now for them, if they were to have some of the dreams that what we might have, like let's say you get up in the middle of the night and you put your slippers on and your slippers become alligators and you're trying to run from the alligators on your feet, but yet you feel like you're running through knee-deep mud, you just can't move all that fast. Or maybe if you've ever had a dream where you're trying to hit something, and no matter how hard you hit it, you feel like you can't do anything. Well, for us, we can realize that maybe it was just too much pizza or ice cream too late at night, whatever the case may be. But for ancient pagan kings, they would have seen these things as saying, oh, the gods are trying to say something to me. So this is a dream that Nebuchadnezzar has. It's so startling and impressive to him that it rouses him out of his sleep. And so this is what he's thinking. The gods are trying to communicate something to me. So he calls in all the people who are supposed to know the mind of the gods and share with him what it is that the gods are attempting to communicate. So let's continue on and see what happens. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell me the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, reward, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. Now look how the Chaldeans respond. Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time because you see my decision is firm. He's not budging. Incidentally, Nebuchadnezzar, as a historical fact, was somebody that you would not trifle with. This was not a man you would want on your bad side. And we just saw some of why. If these guys that he just called in to tell and told them to do an impossible task, humanly impossible, it cannot be done, and yet he is so exacting that he wants it done, and if you can't done, you will be dismembered and your homes will be burned down. And incidentally, that usually carries the connotation of your families will be killed as well. Okay? So this was serious. These guys were in hot water that fast, and they didn't even do anything. It's what they couldn't do that was causing the problem. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed, now listen to this, you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words. He knew that they were simply trying to buy time, and he wasn't really having it. Let's continue on. Before me, till the time has changed. And further, they have agreed to just manufacture to the king whatever it is that they thought he wanted to hear to keep his ego stroked and to keep him happy so that they could likewise stay wealthy and happy as well. So they have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know, if you can tell me the dream, I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. And look how they respond. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. So finally, we get a straight, honest word out of these con men. Okay? They're right. They can't do it. Nobody can do it except God who doesn't dwell with men. At least at that point, not yet. For this reason, the king was angry and very furious and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Now, included in the king's group of advisors, not necessarily in the initial group that were brought before him, but there were a young crop of individuals who had just been brought into the advisors-to-be, if you will, in the kingdom of Babylon. In fact, we read their story in the first chapter, but their names are Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were from the city of Jerusalem, captives from when Babylon went to Jerusalem, sieged it, destroyed it, and they brought a wave of captives back, and they examined them, and they wanted the best of the best from their captives to go and to serve the king, if possible. And of course, these four young men, if you remember the story from Daniel chapter 1, showed themselves to be above and beyond the advisors in training that they already had. So these guys have set themselves apart. But the thing is, this decree to kill all the wise men includes these guys. Well, that doesn't sound so good. Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that's their Hebrew names, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So here we have something that has become a very difficult scenario for these young men. Very rapidly. And they didn't do anything either. They're getting caught up in the fray of the inability of other people to perform a certain task. It's absolutely no fault of their own, but yet they're being caught up in this as well. It's kind of like when you're standing on the shore of a beach and somebody's out there with a speedboat and they get too close to the shore and they're going too fast and take a sharp turn and there's a big wave that gets created and you get hit by the wave. You didn't do anything. You were just standing there enjoying the beach. It was the actions of somebody else that got you hit with a big old wave, right? That's kind of what's happening to these 4 young men right now. But they have a little trick up their sleeve. They talk to the captain of the guard, Daniel does, and he says, hey, give me some time, okay? And we can make this happen for the king. And we know the end of the story. It did happen, but here's the thing. The wise men that the king had at the time were con men. They really were. They were deceiving the king the whole time. Not just on this particular story, but the entire time. They had been doing nothing but telling him what he wanted to hear the whole time. They would, throw chicken bones in a bowl and dump water, cut a liver, whatever the thing was that they would do to engage in their pagan practices. And that's what, oh, king, this is what this is saying, and this is what this is saying, and this is what this is saying. They would use such ambiguous terms that then he could just hear it and something would happen and he could interpret what he just saw to be the fulfillment of what they just said. Because these people are good at this. That's how this stuff works, is use vague and ambiguous enough terms so that you can fill in the blanks on your own and make you think, yeah, they were right, when they were just lying to you the whole time. But these men were essentially what we would consider wicked individuals. And yet, they are also in a position of being blessed by the presence of godly men. There are times when I don't think we can overlook the fact that wicked people are spared because of the presence of the righteous. And that's something that we should all give a hallelujah to, because there are times I'm sure we have all dropped the ball big time. And it may have been because of the presence of others in our lives or those around us who have buoyed us up in prayer before God, that our lives were spared in the process. I can think of many a parent who have spent many a night praying for wayward children. In some cases, they have gone to their graves never seeing the fulfillment of their prayers, only to find out later on that that child that they had been praying for, they have gone to their grave praying for that child ended up coming to Christ. So when that resurrection happens and that parent comes forth, having never seen the fulfillment of that prayer, they will be able to lay hands upon the real fulfillment of their prayer of, God, please save my child. So let's see what it is that happens here. Daniel and his friends are doing just that. They are praying. They go and they pray. But then something miraculous happens. And that's usually what happens when God shows up. So Daniel, he gets the same vision. And he comes back before the king. He's permitted to have an audience. And he begins to speak to him. He says, you, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you. And its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff in the summer threshing floor. Have any of you ever seen chaff? Do you know what chaff is? In the summer threshing floor. That's when they would go out and they would have a sickle, they would harvest wheat, and then they'd have somebody who comes along and they'd grab up the bundle and tie it. It becomes a sheaf. That's a sheaf that they use. And then they'd take those sheaves, and the threshing floor was a floor where there were little tiny spaces between the boards. And they'd take those sheaves and smack them on the ground, and it would break all the kernels off the end of the stalks. And the chaff would be like the kernel that opens up, or the shell that opens up, and the kernel that you want to eat, the part you want to eat is inside. And it's really, really light. If you've ever had a chance to actually walk through a wheat field, like Jesus, and they would pluck the ear off, and you just kind of rub it real quick, and just light. A little, if you blow too much, it's all going to go. But the chaff is very, very light. It just flies out of your hand. But that's the image that's being conveyed here of all of these, gold is a heavy metal. Iron isn't too light either. But yet, the image that's being portrayed here is that these heavy metals would be crushed into powder that's so fine a wind could just blow them away. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now that is some dream. If any of us had that same dream, I think we would take notice of it too. This is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. So here we have Daniel, and I'm assuming his companions, because it just said, we will tell it before the king. They're all standing before the king, and here he is. I can just imagine Nebuchadnezzar, as Daniel and his friends are telling him the details of this dream, and he's slowly sitting forward on the edge of his throne, saying, yes, 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 that's it. It's all coming back to me now. I remember the details. You're right. And he was saying, even before, if you can tell me the dream, then I know you can tell me the interpretation. So they just fulfilled part of it. He knows now that they could tell him the dream, so now he's waiting with bated breath to hear the interpretation of the dream. Now listen what happens. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, and the birds of heaven, he has given them into your hands, and has made you ruler over them all. Now here comes the big ego boost. You are this head of gold. This great image is made out of all these various metals. The head of gold, it represents Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. And as we're going to see in a future study, king and kingdom are synonymous with each other. The leadership of a nation represents the nation. Okay? Makes you kind of wonder who we vote for. Now, if we look at this, though, we know that Babylon, for example, came to a position of great power and prominence in the year 605 BC, and it ruled relatively uncontested until 539 BC. And since the city of Babylon was known as the Golden Empire, a head of gold is a very fitting symbol for this symbol, or for this city. In fact, historians say that the throne and the altar in the great temple in Babylon were made out of 8.5 tons of solid gold. That's a lot of gold. It's hard to imagine really that much gold. But Babylon was this mighty kingdom. It was powerful. The city itself was larger than the city of Rome, larger than the city of Athens, and it dominated the geopolitical scene of that day. Really, if you look at the empire of Babylon, as far as empires go, the size of Babylon itself, I'm talking about the empire, not the city, but the empire, really wasn't all that big in relation to other empires. It's where Babylon sat that made it so powerful. It was right on the hub of east and west travel. So anybody going in those directions had to go through Babylon, which made it, a commercial hub, if you will, with tremendous amounts of cultural and political influence on that time in the world. In fact, we have here inscriptions that have been found. The whole world was prostrate at Babylon's feet. Babylon, the city which is the delight of my eyes, which I have glorified, may it last forever. And that is actually directly accredited to Nebuchadnezzar. And just to give you an idea of the grandeur of the city of Babylon, it had a huge wall that surrounded it. And, city walls, when they're built properly, they're wider at the base than they are at the top. It's what keeps them stable. If you make them straight up like this, there's chance of it falling over. If you make them wider at the base, they're more stable. But at the top, there were areas of the city of Babylon. The walls were so wide at the top that they could have chariot races on tops of these walls. They were huge. There were other areas of the wall where they would have the whole city. They had these kind of quarters, if you will, or what's the word I'm looking for? Quadrants, where they would have certain sections walled off. And many cities would do that. So if somebody invaded a city, they would go through the outer wall, but then there would be an inner wall that they'd have to get to. Maybe they'd like to get to the palace or something, more protection. But Babylon actually had an area attached to the main city, wall that extended out, where they would specifically use to grow crops. So that anybody came and laid siege to the city, they could just continue growing their own food with no threat of the siege that's happening. And the city of Babylon had the river Euphrates running directly under its wall. So the whole point of laying siege to a city is to cut off anybody getting in or anybody getting out. No trade, no access to food or water coming in. Well, that wasn't a problem for Babylon. They had a river running under the city wall, so they had a constant water supply. And they had a nice big section where they could just keep on growing crops to feed the citizens of the city for who knows how many years. They would have outlasted anybody who could have laid siege to the city of Babylon. That's the engineering. That was the very deliberate design of the city, is to make it so powerful that laying siege to it to try to conquer it wouldn't make any sense, because they could outlast anybody who could do it. But Nebuchadnezzar, if you notice here where it says, Babylon, may it last forever. And I'm wondering if he had inspiration to write this based on this very prophecy that Daniel has given to him, that after him another kingdom would arise. But this is exactly what Daniel says to him. Look here in the very next verse. But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours. Well, that is actually what we see happen in history. The Medo-Persian Empire conquered the city of Babylon, the city that had prided itself on being so great and so powerful. The Medo-Persians conquered it in 539 BC, and they lasted until 331 BC. The way that they did that was by taking the river Euphrates that was flowing under the wall of the city. It did not naturally do that. What the Babylonians did was they built a series of dams and dikes to divert the river under the city walls. And so what the Persians did, interestingly enough, how it took so long for somebody to figure this out is beyond me, but they broke those dams and dikes, and it changed the river back to its natural course, diverting it away from the city, and thus then the Medo-Persians had a nice dry riverbed that they could walk on right under the wall, up into the city, and capture it. So now what Daniel is saying is that Nebuchadnezzar, your kingdom is not going to last forever. But then the prophecy still does not stop here with the Medo-Persians. Then a third kingdom of bronze shall rule over all the earth. Now the Medo-Persian Empire was defeated by the Grecian Empire in the year 331 BC. Here we had Alexander the Great, who was able to weld together the individual Greek city-states, if you will, that had a hard time of coming together, but Alexander the Great brought them together and was able to do a tremendous job of conquering the known world.
And next thing you know,
and one of the great feats that he had very early in his mission was to defeat the Medo-Persian army. But even still, this is not where this prophecy stops. Notice here what Daniel says. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, the kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Now here we have the introduction of a new world empire, and we know that the Grecian Empire was defeated by the Romans in the year 168 BC. Now, if you will notice, as we are progressing through these various medals, that each kingdom is lasting a little longer than the one before it, but each medal that represents those kingdoms is of lesser value as it continues. It's almost like each empire lasted a little longer than the one before it, but the level of grandeur and glory was diminished in accordance to the one that came before it. None of them had the glory of Babylon. None of them held up to the glory of Medo-Persia after Medo-Persia, and so on and so forth. Rome lasted the longest of all of these so far, but it did not have necessarily the high-toned glory that Babylon or even Medo-Persia had. Now, Rome fell in the year 476 BC, and this is a very important detail. And look here what it is that the text tells us. Daniel 2:41. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay, so they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. So notice here that God gave this prophecy around about the year 600 BC. He's saying that Nebuchadnezzar, you are here, but you will pass off the world stage, and after you, some other things will happen. They will go down through the ages, down through world empires. Incidentally, the various empires that all came up after Babylon, at least according to this vision, they were all conquered by another empire, but Rome was never conquered by another single empire like the preceding ones were. Rome kind of fell apart. It disintegrated from the inside. There was all kinds of political issues. There were all kinds of social issues that were going on, many of which we here in America are facing today and are actually happening around the world as well. These things were all happening not only in the Roman Empire, but other empires as well, near the time of their collapse. But what we see here is this very interesting picture of what happened to the Roman Empire after it collapsed. Nobody has been able to weld the Roman Empire back together the way that it was. People have tried it for many years. It has been tried through war. Napoleon attempted it. Hitler attempted it. It has been tried through things like intermarriage. Here we have a picture of Queen Victoria, who was known as the grandmother of Europe at one point in time because she had all these children and grandchildren who were married off into the other various countries of Europe. And thus it was an attempt to bring the European powers back together through intermarriage, basically making it one big happy family, if you will. But that didn't work either. And if you think about it, the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, that's the part of the Roman Empire that we're talking about here, that essentially encompasses what we know of as Europe today. But all of this came apart. None of it worked. In fact, if you think about it, even today, they are still trying to bring Europe back together into one big, massive force. We currently call it the EU, or the European Union. They are attempting now to weld this all together through economics. So it has been attempted through war, it has been attempted through intermarriage, it's being attempted through economics. Every single attempt has had some apparent success in the short term. Every single attempt has ultimately failed. And this one that they're working on now is no different. What is the big news coming out of the EU right now? But we call it Brexit. Here we have Britain, who's trying to leave the EU, which if they do, it will bring the economy of the EU to its knees. We have other countries who are a part of the EU that are barely able to hang on at all economically. They are also dragging the economy of the EU down. But you have other countries that actually have a relatively strong economy. As such, we have now partly strong and partly fragile, just like what this prophecy has said. There were some countries that had strong military attempts, others that were weak. Now we have some countries that are strong economically, others that are weak. It is the same thing being spread out over time. Now, incidentally, I want to share with you a story of a man by the name of Franz Hassel. Franz Hassel was conscripted into the German army in World War II. And he ran into a little bit of a problem at one day when he was in the military. He was overheard by some of his officers saying how Hitler was not going to win this war. Well, news got back to his commanding officers, and as a result, they brought Franz into an office and they spoke to him saying, hey, what are you saying Hitler cannot win this war? I mean, this is a guy who's in Hitler's army, and the fact that he is saying that Hitler isn't going to win this war, this is tantamount to treason. He could have been shot or hung or executed in some way because of these kinds of comments. Well, what Mr. Hassel did is he shared with these officers the very prophecy that I am sharing with you today. He walked these gentlemen through this prophecy of Daniel 2, showed them how it is that down at the time of the feet of iron and clay, that it would not be brought together. It would never adhere one to another, and Hitler's attempt to bring Europe back together through military force would be thwarted. Well, what ended up resulting from all of this is that he was commanded to stockpile fuel. And what ended up happening is, yes, just like what he said, Hitler failed. He's dead. The German army is defeated. And because that his unit was stockpiling fuel, all the men were able to travel. They were a good distance away from home. They were all able to get home because of that extra stockpile of fuel that they had. And thus, a knowledge of this prophecy not only saved the life of Franz Hassel, but also the lives of those who were in his company as well. All because of listening to the prophetic voice of God. You know, maybe today, as you're listening to this message, you are skeptical about whether or not the Bible can be trusted. Friends, I can tell you the Bible can be trusted. We know for a certainty that Daniel wrote this prophecy down some 600 years, roughly thereabouts, before the birth of Christ. And it is something that has stood the test of time throughout the ages. It was not something that was written after the fact. It was something that was written ahead of the events that are depicted. It is prophetic. It is foretelling the future, and we are still living to this very day within the scope of this prophecy. We live in the time of these divided feet and toes of iron and clay. We live in this time right now. But there is one more event that is yet to happen. And what is it that the scriptures say? Here we have verses 44 and 45. And in the days of these kings, that's these kings of the divided Roman Empire, which the time we are still living in. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and the interpretation is sure. This one prophecy gives us the master key to understanding all the other prophetic visions in the Bible of end times, extending from the time of the prophet, in this case it's Daniel, down to the end of time as we know it. This description that we just read of God setting up a new kingdom, this is not talking about Jesus coming, being born of Mary at his first advent. It is referring to the second advent when all these other empires are crushed and moved out of the way, and God's kingdom sets up and reigns supreme for an unending eternal span of time over everything that there is. We live in a time just before Jesus is going to come back and make this happen. The Word of God can be trusted, which means that God himself can be trusted. Indeed, God can be trusted, friends. The lesson that we just went through is one of many that demonstrates to us in real time that the Bible is a source that can be held to with certainty, that it is reliable, valid, and more importantly, just as applicable today as it has ever been in the past. The question is not whether the Bible can be trusted or not, but rather it is this: are we taking the time necessary to properly understand what is contained on the pages of the Bible? This is a question that we will explore in each study that we have together. One of the major aspects to making sure that we are understanding the Bible properly is to put things into their proper context. That context includes things such as who wrote any particular portion of the Scriptures, who was it written to, when and where were they living, and what was going on at the time. Each of these questions is vital if there is to be a proper understanding not only of the Bible, but of any ancient document. So let's take just a moment to explore some of these very questions right now. One of the primary characters in the lesson that we just finished is an ancient king named Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was a pivotal character in Old Testament history. No other foreign or non-Israelite king is mentioned nearly as much in the Old Testament. In fact, the name Nebuchadnezzar is brought up 89 times between the books of 2 Kings and the book of Daniel. So no other foreign king is mentioned nearly as much as Nebuchadnezzar is in the Old Testament. So you may be thinking, well, what about Pharaoh? Well, it is true that the name Pharaoh, which is really just a title for king, does come up some 230 times in the Old Testament, but we must also keep in mind that Pharaoh is a title applied to a multitude of Egyptian kings spanning a wide course of time. And so therefore, no one single Pharaoh is referred to as much as Nebuchadnezzar is. So why is Nebuchadnezzar mentioned so many times? Why is he so important? Well, it doesn't have nearly as much to do with the person of Nebuchadnezzar as much as it has to do with what it is that Nebuchadnezzar did. Nebuchadnezzar was a mighty king, and he was not somebody to be trifled with, as we will see in future lessons. But Nebuchadnezzar was more than just a mighty king. He was a tool that God used for judgment against a people who were very rebellious. You see, the people of Jerusalem and the land of Judah were in bondage to Egypt and slaves there. The God of the Bible brought them out of that bondage, but they did not retain the worship of this God and turned rather to idolatry. God told them that if they were to do such things, that their enemies would come and take them captive, and that is exactly what happened over time. But they continued to rebel, a spirit of rebellion that we will see continues over and over throughout the Old Testament. It was through this spirit of rebellion that God brought Nebuchadnezzar as a vessel of judgment against the people of God, as a way of demonstrating that if they will continue in their rebellious activities, that their enemies will lord over them. Thus we have Nebuchadnezzar coming and besieging Jerusalem after he defeated Syria, and later would go on to conquer Egypt, and then later he would go back and burn Jerusalem to the ground because of continued rebellious efforts. This same spirit of rebellion that was manifested against God continued to be manifested against Nebuchadnezzar. And just as God withdrew his protection because of rebellion, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem because of rebellion, a destruction for which the city laid in ruins for a long time before it was rebuilt. Nebuchadnezzar came to power when his father Nebuchadnezzar died. Nebuchadnezzar was actually the crown prince of Babylon when he was on military campaign and had some interactions with Jerusalem when he received word that his father had passed away. Nebuchadnezzar returned as quickly as possible to Babylon, secured his throne, and then returned to his military campaign as the king of Babylon. All of this took place in roughly the year 605 BC. Jerusalem would be destroyed completely shortly after that period of time, again because of continued rebellion. Of Nebuchadnezzar, it is stated this: under his reign, Babylon became the most powerful city-state in the region, and Nebuchadnezzar II, himself the greatest warrior king and ruler of the known world. That's from Joshua Mark of 2018. Nebuchadnezzar was the ruling king of Babylon for 43 years. But just like Daniel told him in his dream, his empire would not last forever. In fact, in just about 25 years after Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC, the kingdom of Babylon would be conquered and given to the Medes and the Persians. And this is just as Daniel said would happen. And that brings us to the second primary character of this story that we just finished, and that is the person in whose name the book is titled, Daniel. Interestingly enough, the first time that we see Nebuchadnezzar is in the book of 2 Kings. Here we read in the scriptures, "In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. Then he returned and rebelled against him." Jehoiakim did not last as king of Jerusalem very long. In fact, he actually died in his early 30s. This left his son Jehoiachin king of Jerusalem at the age of 18. But the rebellion of Jehoiakim prompted Nebuchadnezzar to return Jerusalem himself after Jehoiachin had ruled for only 3 months. The return of Nebuchadnezzar to Jerusalem is recorded in the book of 2 Kings, chapter 24. Here we read, At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the city as his servants were besieging it. We see that it's taken from the New King James Version. It is at that time that Nebuchadnezzar carried off 10,000 captives from Jerusalem to Babylon, and we are even giving a list of the group that composed those captives. Verses 14 and 15 of the same chapter state, "Also he carried into captivity all Jerusalem, all the captains, and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. He carried Jehoiachin captive to Babylon, the king's mother, the king's wives, his officers, and the mighty men of the land he carried into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon." This list is further broken down into how many of what class were taken, but note that the list clearly indicates that they were the king's officers and members of his family, which may very well have included more than simply those who are listed. It is quite probable that amongst this group was Daniel. This would have made Daniel a very young man at the time, seeing as how he lived through the entire time of what is known as the Babylonian captivity, or also called the diaspora, or the dispersion of the Jews. But this also would have made perhaps his closest companions, known most commonly as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their Babylonian names, very young when the Babylonian captivity would have happened, and based on Daniel's own reckoning, he lived well into the time of the Persian and Median coalition when they conquered the city of Babylon, thus putting him at least into his mid-80s when that took place. So here we have an understanding of who Daniel is. He may well have been a member of the royal family in Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar came to defeat the city. Yet there is something of greater importance regarding Daniel than simply his age at the time of the Babylonian captivity, and that is the choice that he made to devote himself to the God that the people of Israel had chosen to turn their backs on. We see this choice take place in Daniel chapter 1, where we read, "Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies." There are several things that can be gleaned from this statement. One is the fact that the Babylonian captivity happened to the Israelite people because of a lack of faithfulness. And here we are told that Daniel made a conscious choice not to defile himself with the things that were being offered to him in Babylon. It is quite likely that Daniel clearly understood the reason for the fall of Jerusalem and perhaps even recognized his own lack of spiritual fervor and thus made a marked decision to be right with God rather than to allow disobedience to God to continue being a factor in his own life. It would also appear that his three companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, also made similar choices. Whatever the reasoning, Daniel and his friends made very deliberate, conscious choices to follow God and keep his commandments. What makes this of such great importance for us today is the fact that we are faced with the very same choice. Obedience to God must be a clear, deliberate choice. The Bible tells us, "Be doers of the word, and not hearers only, and for not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified." This was the precipice upon which Daniel stood, and it is the same choice that you and I must make today. It is not enough to merely hear the word of God or even to just agree with it, but we must do what God commands us and follow what is contained within the Scriptures. We will get more into that and give more detail of what exactly that looks like as we continue in our times of study together. The last thing that I would like for us to spend a bit of time exploring has to do with the time in which the book of Daniel was written. There are two primary theories regarding the authorship and time when Daniel was written. The first theory holds that, of course, the book of Daniel was written by a man named Daniel, written during his lifetime, and because of the real-time events that are recorded in the book of Daniel, that they must have been written sometime in the 5th and 6th centuries BC. The second theory holds that the book of Daniel was written much later and by one or more individuals. This theory holds that the book of Daniel was written in about the 2nd century BC, and that the prophecies contained within the book of Daniel end with the Greeks, as it was the Greeks who were the ruling party over the Jewish people at that time. One of the reasons why this theory is held is because the book of Daniel was written in 2 separate languages. The first language is Hebrew and the second language is Aramaic. The book of Daniel starts in Hebrew, then switches to Aramaic, and then switches back to Hebrew again. The Aramaic that was used was believed to be a later form of Aramaic. However, as research and discoveries were continued, it was found that the Aramaic used in the book of Daniel was actually an early empirical form of Aramaic, and thus fits quite well into the time frame of Daniel living during the time of Nebuchadnezzar and when the Persian and Median coalition conquered Babylon. And since Daniel, of course, worked in the king's courts, the use of him having imperial Aramaic at his disposal would have been quite plausible. Another contention is the book Daniel containing predictive prophecy. Critics of the book of Daniel hold that because the events depicted in prophecy are so accurate and so spot on, that they had to have been penned after the fact rather than ahead of time. This reasoning, of course, sets aside the idea of an all-knowing, all-powerful God who declares the end from the beginning and from ancient times things that have not yet happened. We will get more detailed about these factors as we move through our study in the book of Daniel. But my friends, you can put your trust in the book of Daniel. You can put your trust in the Bible, and more importantly, you can put your trust in the God of the Bible and the salvation that He provides through us in the name of Jesus Christ. Well, this concludes our time together, friends. But don't fret, for we will be right back here at the same time next week. And remember, as it is read in the Scriptures, the stone that the builders have rejected has become the chief cornerstone. And this is, of course, Jesus Christ and the truth of His Word. My name is Pastor Craig Fish. I look forward to seeing you next week. God bless. Thank you for joining us today for In the Scriptures. It is our great pleasure to have been a part of your day today. If you would like to ask any questions or have a comment regarding the material that is covered on today's program, then I would invite you to send us an email at contact@inthescriptures.com. That's contact@inthescriptures.com. We also have a free offer this month. It comes to us from the ministry It Is Written and is simply titled, Can God Be Trusted? If you would like your free copy of this study guide, then send us an email at that same address of contact@inthescriptures.com and let us know how to get your free copy of Can God Be Trusted into your hands. If you would like to participate in a thoughtful, rational, and edifying dialogue regarding any of the material that is covered on In the Scriptures, then we will be happy to correspond with you in an edifying and intelligent manner. It is our mission to engage with you, the viewing audience, in a respectful and thought-provoking way, so that all of us as people can be built up and strengthened in the Word of God, and more importantly, that Christ is glorified. Once again, that email address is contact@inthescriptures.com. Thank you again for watching. Have a wonderful and Christ-centered day.